We all know what it's like to be the pre-flop raiser, get called, and see a really bad board texture. But have you ever wondered which are the actual worst board textures for the pre-flop raiser? Well, if you have, then this video is for you. Now, to give you an idea of how we're going to do this, we're going to look at a few different examples, but we're not really going to be focusing on the solution archive. Instead, we're going to be looking at aggregate reports, but in particular, we're actually going to be looking at data that I've drawn out of the aggregate reports for a variety of different scenarios. So the way I'm referring to this is we're aggregating the aggregate. We're taking different scenarios and our overall frequencies for c-betting in various different spots, and we're comparing, for example, a tournament spot and a cash game spot to see what trends might exist. We've picked out two cash game stack depths here of 100 and 200 big blinds. We've picked out two MTT stack depths of 25 and 50 big blinds. And all these examples are going to be single raise pot, and they're either going to be low jack big blind or low jack button formations. So one in position, one out of position. Just to give us a general sense of the trends here in terms of which boards are causing us to slow down and c-bet less often. Now, the three categories of boards that I've picked out as being the most dangerous ones, first of all, it's going to be monotone. And in particular, we're going to split those up into ace-high monotone and connected monotone. Now, when we use the term connected here, remember that that refers to board textures where a flopped straight is possible. So 8-7-5 or 8-7-4, for example, would be connected. 8-7-3 or 8-7 deuce does not count as a connected board. Counts as an open-ender board, let's say. Second is the connected category as a whole. Ace-high wheel and 7-high or lower connected being the two categories we're going to really focus on. And finally, we have paired boards, but really only one specific category of paired boards. It's the boards where the board is ace-XX, where X is between an 8 and a 4. So that's going to be ace-8-8 through ace-4-4. And those in particular you'll see are quite interesting. So with that said, let's dive into some of this data and start talking about what trends there are and why they exist. So first, let's look at our monotone boards. You can see here that I've got the frequencies for each of these formations listed under the all boards category. Generally not going to be seeing anything too surprising here. The MTT formations, we're going to have higher c-bet frequencies because generally the ranges are wider. There's more money in the pot, so the caller is calling wider and so on. And if we focus on the left-hand side for the cash game ranges, you can see already that across all monotone boards, there's about a 12% drop in the in-position spots, 13%-ish. And then there's about a 5% drop in the out of position spots. So immediately monotone boards as a whole, we're slowing down a bit. On the ace-high monotone, that drop is going to be amplified in all four of these cases. There is a little bit of a caveat in the connected monotone category, simply because connected monotone also includes boards like king-queen-jack monotone, queen-jack 10, where maybe we actually have sets and two-pair hands that our opponent doesn't have. So that's going to slightly neutralize it a little bit, but in a general sense, you can see that our frequency on these connected monotone boards is significantly lower than our overall c-bet frequency for the spot as a whole. In the MTT spots, there's another weird caveat here where in the 25 big blind in-position spot, our c-bet frequency actually goes up on monotone boards relative to all boards. And the reason for this is that the big blind is jamming pre-flop with a lot of suited hands. And that means that when they defend pre-flop, they're actually a little bit more weighted towards having more offsuit hands. So they're going to be jamming a lot of their suited ace hands, suited Broadway hands for 25 bigs, but they're going to call with a bunch of offsuit stuff that doesn't make flushes. So that means monotone boards at 25 when we're in position, not quite as bad. But if you look at the out of position, similar trend. Monotone boards drop our c-bet frequency by about 12%, 10%, depending on the exact stack depths. And again, you can see that connected category is slightly offsetting things, but there's definitely a pretty big drop-off there in most of these cases. Of course, the MTT ranges for the fairly shallow stacks are going to be affecting things a little bit here, so it's not that easy to immediately identify those same trends at the 25 big blind stack depth, but it is just going to be a product of the fact that a lot of hands are jamming pre at this stack depth against a raise, so just have to keep that in mind. But let's talk about why some of these trends are happening. In essence, what we're seeing is that in any single raise pot formation, both us and our opponent, or both hero and villain, raiser and caller, are going to possess a lot of suited hands. And one of those four suits in every spot is going to flop a flush on any monotone board. So that means that even when we account for the offsuit hands and the pairs that exist in the ranges, both players are going to flop flushes about 10% of the time. And that, of course, means that a lot of the other hands in our range have to play more cautiously. We're not going to be able to put in a lot of money across 3 streets if we have to worry about running into a flush 10% of the time. So generally speaking, we're going to have to slow down a lot more on monotone boards, and in particular, the connected ones where our opponent can have a lot more of the sets, and the ace-high ones where our opponent can have a decent chunk of top pair, and maybe they can even have more flushes, given that the ace is already out there and they're already weighted more towards the Broadway flush cards, suited connector flush cards perhaps. That's going to slightly influence things as well. But generally speaking, these monotone boards as a whole, and in particular the ace-high and the connected ones, we're going to have to slow down a lot here. Now, our next board category, of course, is the connected boards. And as you can imagine, there's a few trends here that are going to be affected by the exact nature of the board, but we're seeing some similar things to what we saw previously. In fact, in this case, even the MTT spots are starting to obey the same principles that we might expect in a lot of situations. We can see that there's a big drop-off in all of the outer position spots down to about a 12 or 13% frequency in the cash game situations, and a 30 to 45% frequency in the MTT spots. And particularly when we add the other elements like the ace-high wheel boards or the 7-high or lower boards, we start to see some really low c-bet frequencies. The frequencies for 7-high or lower, so 765, 654, etc., in the cash game spots start to go down to basically 0. We start to range check. Now, you might be wondering why the ace-high wheel boards are in this category. Well, in the cash game situation, a lot of the time it's going to come down to the fact that the preflop caller can have 2 of the sets. So, for example, they can have deuces and 3s on ace-deuce 3. We can only have aces. And at depth, that's going to have a big impact. In the MTT spots, you do actually see that the ace-high wheel category, when we're in position at the shallow stack depth, is going to jump up to almost a range bet. But the only reason for that is because a lot of the ace-5 suiteds, ace-4 suiteds, ace-3 suiteds are going to jam from the big blind here against the low jack open. So that's going to slightly restrict things there. But you can see here, those board textures, even in the MTT spots, are not as good as the average for this particular formation. And it comes down to the fact that even in the MTT scenarios, big blind is defending a lot of ace-x hands that the preflop raiser, when they're opening from the low jack, can't necessarily have. Obviously, when they're flatting from the button, it's going to slightly change things. The exact distribution of ace-x hands in their range is going to alter a little bit. But you can certainly see there's a trend here where these 2 textures of ace-high wheel and then the 7-high or lower are seeing substantially different c-bet frequencies with a big drop in most of these formations. Again, the question becomes, why is this happening? Well, unlike monotone boards, our opponent isn't always going to have the flop straight in their range, depending on what the exact flop is. So connected is not quite the same as monotone, because on any monotone board, our opponent can have a flush, but it's not necessarily always the case that our opponent can have the straight on a connected board. For example, 6-4-3, it's connected, but there are a lot of spots where our opponent can't have 7-5 or 5-deuce. But on connected flops, where our opponent can possess a lot of 2 pairs and sets, this can make life a lot more difficult for us. And this is where the ace-high wheel and the 7-high or lower start to become a real factor. Ace-5-4, ace-3-deuce, etc. They can have a lot of the suited ace hands there. On 7-6-5, they can have a lot of 2 pairs. They can have a lot of sets. They can also have the straight, and so on. So these board textures really start to become problematic because of how many 2 pairs and sets are going to exist in the caller's range, even in circumstances where they're calling in the big blind. So as we saw before, even when we're the in-position player, we're seeing a drop-off to about 40-50% sometimes with our overall c-bet frequency on these lower card connected boards because of how many 2 pairs and sets also exist on top of the straight. The exception here is the high card connected boards, because the high card textures, the high card connected textures like the King Queen Jacks, the Jack 10 9s, Ace Jack 10, whatever it might be, those are boards where we can have a lot of sets in 2 pairs. And crucially, we can almost always have the straights on those boards as well. Even if it's Queen Jack 9, for example, we can have King 10 suited. We can often have King 10 offsuit. So in a lot of cases there, those high card connected boards are not that bad for us. And in fact, because our opponent's range is quite often going to be pocket pair heavy when they're calling pre-flop, especially if they're calling in position, there are quite a lot of those boards where we get to bet a lot, specifically because we get to put their low pocket pairs in a tough spot, even with a small bet size. So you'll actually find some of the high card connected textures are pretty close to range bets in certain formations across various different types of scenarios and formats of the game. So moving on to our final category of boards here, it's the paired boards, but in particular, it's those ace 8-8 through to ace 4-4 textures. Now, the reason why I've isolated those textures here is, as you can see, there's quite a big difference between those and the rest of the paired boards. In fact, if we look at the cash game scenarios, if we look at all paired boards as a whole, our c-bet frequencies actually go up. So this is indicating that there's a lot of paired board textures where we're completely fine with betting at a very high frequency, if not range betting. But the ace 8-8 through ace 4-4 specifically, our c-bet frequency drops all the way down to about 20 to 40% in all these cases. In fact, as you can see on the left, on the far left, we go from 71% across all paired boards to 32.7% on ace 8-8 through ace 4-4. The factors behind this we'll discuss in just a second, but if you look over at the MTT spots, you can see some similar stuff. The paired board frequency is still pretty high when we're c-betting in position, and in fact, it goes up when we're c-betting out of position. But there's a big 20% or so drop-off when we're c-betting in position on the ace 8-8 to ace 4-4. Now, there is an increase when we're out of position on these boards, and the only reason for that, once again, outlier at this 25 big blind depth, is that the in-position player is not flatting as many ace-x hands and pairs at this depth. They're jamming a lot pre-flop. So that's going to be a major contributing factor here. And again, these 25 big blind stacks certainly going to have a bit of a different configuration of ranges. So certain things will change that. But if you look at the in-position 50 big blind spots, we're very much seeing the same thing. Again, the out-of-position spots, there's a little bit of an outlier there. We're not quite seeing the same principles, although the ace 8-8 to ace 4-4 are betting less often than the other paired boards. So again, some small nuances with the ranges there, but you can still see the principle that we're talking about here. So why is this happening? Well, the generalities here are that most paired boards, especially the lower card ones, are generally pretty good for the pre-flop raiser because our prevalence of strong pocket pairs in our range means that we're going to be able to bet those boards a lot. Those hands are very strong on those boards. And generally speaking, that's going to influence our strategy towards being pretty aggressive, especially in spots where our opponent has a lot of air hands. But the board being ace high in particular makes pocket kings through pocket nines a lot weaker. And that's an area where we're going to have way more of that stuff than our opponent is. And in particular, on top of that, the pair being an 8 through a 4 allows our opponent to have a lot of trips, particularly when they're defending the big blind. So if anything about this board changes, if the top card is lower, so if it's a king, a queen, a jack, etc., then now our overpairs, our pocket aces, kings, queens, etc., are very strong. And if the pair is towards either end of the deck, so if it's ace-ace-8, for example, well, now we have a lot of trip aces. If the board is king-king-8, we have a lot of trip kings. We have ace-king, we have king-queen, etc. If it's ace-deuce-deuce, well, our opponent doesn't really have a deuce very often. Ace-3-3, same thing. But that 8 through 4 category, they have a lot of suited hands. They have a lot of hands that can make trips there. So generally speaking, we have to be a little bit more wary on that category. And that's going to contribute to making it so that our overall c-bet frequencies across the board are going to slightly decrease in these scenarios. So it's not a blanket principle there, but it is going to be relevant across a lot of spots. So to summarize our strategy a little bit here and give you a little bit of a guideline, what you'll observe here over these different categories is that they're all categories where our strong pocket pairs as the pre-flop raiser are getting a lot worse. They're not as willing to put a lot of money in. And in contrast, a lot of the hands that are willing to put a lot of money in are going to be 5-card hands. They're going to be sets. They're going to be full houses. They're going to be straights. They're going to be flushes, etc. So ultimately, what it comes down to is that the boards that are going to be most dangerous for us as the pre-flop raiser are going to be boards where our pre-flop pocket pairs are no longer as strong as they previously were. Any board where a strong pocket pair like pocket aces, pocket kings, is not going to want to put a lot of money in, is going to be a board that we're going to be checking a lot more often. And conversely, when our pocket pairs are stronger, when our pocket pairs are happier to put more money in, we're going to be very content to play more aggressively as a whole. And you can certainly see the trends across all of this data that even no matter what scenario you're in, whether you're in a cash game, a tournament spot, the boards where you have to slow down a lot are the ones where your strong pocket pairs aren't going to be able to play big pots at a high frequency. We did obviously see some outliers with the MTT ranges because of the nuances of those short stack scenarios, but hopefully everything was still evident for you in terms of why these particular board textures are the most dangerous board textures.